And while we're talking about different fields of inquiry, and it'd be interesting to talk about how they might see mental illness, like either from different fields of inquiry or just as a topic in general.
Yeah, so like you had just mentioned like the dual role that Damien Karras has to play throughout the story because he is both a trained medical psychiatrist and an ordained priest. And like when Chris first comes to him, says, I need a priest for my daughter. And he's like, no, you don't. You need a psych.
That's right.
I will come to her as a psychiatrist. And that is like what Damien, the role Damien plays throughout is he is taking it much more from a psychiatric angle at first, and it's important that like it's made very clear in the book, literally up until the very end, Damien does not believe that Reagan is actually possessed. He believes that she is suffering from a severe delusion, that she is possessed, and he wants to use the exorcism as kind of like a placebo effect.
Yes.
To try to but it is in the end, it's kind of implied that he does finally catch on. I think it's the moment where the demon lifts the entire bed up off of the ground during the exorcism, and he kind of said some things to himself. This could be a real like a real possession. And then obviously,
that's interesting because at that moment that he sees the bed rise, at least in the movie, he actually stops delivering the ritual response for the exorcism, and then is kind of jogged back to it by Marin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think these things, because that is what the psychiatrists throughout the movie try to rule out any mental illnesses at all. They go from schizophrenia to, the very first diagnosis is just a general nerve disorder.
Right.
And then they move on to epilepsy, and then they move on to schizophrenia, and they just keep going and going and
Brain
going.
lesions, yeah.
Until they've exhausted their options. But I do have two big points on this. First of all, it's weird because even though obviously like there is a supernatural cause behind the possession, there is this like very real frustration that I feel like a lot of parents with children who do suffer from rare mental or otherwise illnesses have gone through when they go to doctors, because the doctor's approach, there's always, I've heard a phrase used in medical jargon, which is if it has four hooves and it neighs, it's a horse. Which is this idea that like while there may be other options, it's almost always the most common option. Sure. It's like don't diagnose it as a zebra if it can be called a horse. Right. And so I feel like for a lot of parents who they could probably resonate with this idea of this sense of frustration of going to doctors and trying to get their children help, and watching you go to doctor after doctor, and then just every time the doctor tests something, no, it came back negative, no, this came back negative, and just repeatedly being told, I don't know.
And the interesting thing is, in terms of method of inquiry, the doctors, perhaps the psychologists too, or psychiatrists, they're ruling things out. Right, let's get rid of this possibility, get rid of this one, and see what we can reduce it to. Whereas faith is about, like, let's leap to a conclusion and just assume it's this conclusion and then try to make the facts fit that narrative.
Right.
And then you were saying you had a second point?
Yeah, the second point is the story kind of, in my view, tries to have its cake and eat it too when it comes to its use of mental illness in the story. Because it's providing this story of genuine demonic possession in a world very much like our own. And it's a world where, like when Chris asks Damien how to perform, like how to get an exorcism done, and he says first you have to get in a time machine and go 500 years back in time, because that doesn't happen anymore. And she's like, well, why not? He says, because we learned about mental illness. Yes. Now, and I think this is a very compelling point, but also we're dealing with a legitimate demonic possession, and I think if you want to put forward this narrative that demonic possessions can happen, as it does in The Exorcist, then I don't buy that there would not be documented proof of actual exorcisms happening in the past, and you would think it would not be this outdated practice if it was a thing that actually happened.
Interesting.
Yeah, like in after getting this case handed to him, Damien goes to his personal library and just starts pulling book after book off the shelves into the school's library. He works at a college, and pulling all these books to reference, looking at all of these cases of supposed demonic possession to see whether or not it was mental illness or if it could be considered legitimate, or to see what aligned with Reagan's symptoms from these other cases.
And I think it's also kind of funny because obviously the book was written a while ago. It was in the early 70s. And the field of psychology is a very it's a very
different,
ever-changing field. Our trying to understand the human mind is a very hard thing to do that people have been trying to do for a very long time. And 10 years from now, our current understanding of psychology will be considered outdated. That's just how it goes. And you have some of the most influential psychologists of all time. I'm thinking of Sigmund Freud, for example. In his time, he was thought of as a genius in the medical field. And you ask any modern day psychologist, and most modern psychologists think of Sigmund Freud as a crackpot. Right. They don't really believe anything that Freud said, and it's interesting because I do have a surface level. I'm very interested in psychology, so I do my own research on it and everything, and so it's fun reading through The Exorcist with a 1970s understanding of psychology, where they'll put forward things like Damien trying to rule out genuine possession by saying, well, it could be psychokinesis. Which psychokinesis, as we know now, is that's not a thing, right. And so it's this funny situation where this psychiatrist that's trying to appear, trying to be reasonable and rule out genuine possibilities, he goes, well, it can't be this pseudoscientific understanding of the world, right, because it could be this pseudoscientific understanding of the world. And I think it's very, because the field of psychology is an ever-changing thing, and there's a reason that the DSM has to update every few years or so. There's been 5 iterations so far, and probably a 6th one on the way. It's our understanding of how mental illness and the human mind in general works changes constantly.
Yeah, look at the original DSM. I mean, it's very different,
It makes me think of how the psychiatrists in one of the first appointments that Reagan has with them want to diagnose her with hysteria, and I'm just sitting there what do you mean hysteria is still a valid diagnosis in 1973?
Yes, this girl has
a wandering uterus. Yeah.
The woman disease.